Hello, Read 581, and welcome to week 4. It is an exciting week as we wrap up our assessments and get ready to start intervention next week. Hooray! Let's talk about your readings from our course text instructing students. You have chapter 6, which is assessment for identifying specific strengths and weaknesses in reading. I would definitely prioritize this, and I will be sharing more as the lecture continues about this, but you can probably skip through some parts. There's one part where it talks about, portfolio assessment and performance assessment, not as relevant to our purposes, so that can kind of be glazed over, but for the most part, this is a very helpful chapter. I would read that, as well as QRI 6, pages 67 through 84 is all about analyzing and summarizing results. So you will want to read that. And if you picked up the Next Step Forward and guided reading, it's recommended you read the Decide section for your students' corresponding level. And I'll tell you what you can find in that section later in this screencast. So check out those this week. Assignments due. First and foremost, you need to plan and conduct any remaining assessment sessions. You may need to have one more, two more, break it up, who knows? So get those assessments done so that you can submit your initial assessment report by September 19th. That is the hard deadline so that we can get started with the intervention piece. Things to keep on your radar. Next week, intervention begins. And then week 6, you're going to submit your first weekly intervention plan and reflection, the whippers, a lot like the whappers from 516. And what you're going to do is submit 2 at a time. So just every other week, you're going to submit your work from, week 5 and week 6 will get submitted week 6. Then week 8, you'll submit your plans and reflections from week 7 and 8. So you're submitting every other week, 2 at a time of those. For more information on that assignment, you can see the assignment folder dedicated just to this assignment. And then week 7, your video reflection is due. So you will also want to be previewing the assignment materials for that and begin work on that. As a reminder, your video reflection needs to be completed before we do your pre-observation meeting, because we are going to be reviewing and discussing the work on your video reflection together. That's going to be what is going to frame our coaching cycle, our cycle of inquiry and growth and all that good stuff. So get that video reflection done before the pre-observation meeting. So definitely check out the assignment resources so you have a better expectation of what those assignments entail. All right, so I'm going to quickly highlight some things from our readings this week in regard to assessment for learning. So again, still focused on this first course objective, which involves analyzing assessment results in order to identify reader strengths and needs. So this week in particular, we are really focused on that analysis piece so that you can make decisions for intervention next week. So chapter 6, identifying strengths and weaknesses, part 2. They start out with information on how to assess knowledge of word meanings. Another way of saying that would be vocabulary, right? So they talk about formal measures like the diagnostic assessment of reading or the test of reading comprehension. They talk about informal measures like a knowledge rating graph. They give you a sample of that in figure 6.1. And then page 184 is what I think is pretty helpful. They give you a bunch of different methods for how to assess words, ranging from an unaided recall, where they have to use the word in a sentence or explain the meaning of the word or give a synonym or an opposite, or an aided recall where they need to do a matching test or a multiple choice test where they choose the opposite or choose the best synonym. So lots of different methods for assessing words, but they do caution you against the use of multiple choice tests as a measure of vocabulary knowledge, because as I talked about in the screencast for the assessment chart, I know that was how the classroom teacher of my student assessed knowledge of vocabulary, and really it doesn't show you the degree or level of word knowledge they have, as well as how they can use that word in productive vocabulary. Do they just have a vague familiarity with that word, or do they actually have the ability to use it in productive vocabulary in speech and in writing? Next, they move on to talking about assessing comprehension. So they talk about formal measures for doing this and some informal measures. They talk about using group administered diagnostic tests, and that reminded me of something I wanted to tell you about QRI 6 on page 78. The last section I'm having you read from QRI 6 is basically about practical application of the QRI 6, and it's wonderful because it gives you some ideas. It's section 11, specific uses of the QRI 6, and they talk about, okay, so you're a classroom teacher, how can you use this to estimate individual student reading level, and then how could you do group administration to save yourself some time, both group administration of the level passages as well as the inferential questions. So, if you're wondering, how do I manage my time and balance giving this QRI 6 to a whole class of students, they have some suggestions for you on page 78. So, also with assessing comprehension in the course text, they talk about teacher-constructed instruments and procedures. And really the one thing I want to make sure I emphasize is that when you are assessing comprehension, it's really important to look at the specific types of questions that are being asked and that are difficult for the student. And, what do you hypothesize is difficult about that question? Yeah, QRI tells you it's implicit or explicit, but beyond that, what does this question require of them? What type of thinking? What type of skill? That kind of analysis is what needs to be happening for you to plan the most appropriate instruction. So I'm going to model that and then direct you to some specific resources for further examples of that. As a reminder, I wanted to touch on comprehension a little bit because that is one of the topics of this week on your course syllabus. There are 3 levels of comprehension, starting with the literal level, that is the foundation or base, that is recognizing stated information or basically being able to read the lines. So having an explicit understanding of what is being stated. Interpretive comprehension is where inferencing falls, and that is being able to read between the lines. And then lastly is critical comprehension, and that is the highest level of comprehension, and that involves evaluation of the written material or being able to read beyond the lines. Also within comprehension, there are many facets of comprehension, and I want to direct you to your core teaching reading source book. The chapter on comprehension is where I pulled this chart. But just a reminder, these are all the different comprehension skills a reader should be able to do. So you want to think about how proficient your student is in doing these different things. I wanted to bring in an article that I usually have 516 students read because it was pretty eye-opening for me as far as how to look at comprehension issues and kind of label what the student is doing. And so I'm not having you read this, but I do want to highlight it because I think it's appropriate for what you're going to be doing with your analysis. So in this article by DeWitts and DeWitts, they introduce us to Mark, who is a student who reads with accuracy, fluency, and expression. He read with 98% accuracy at grade level and 132 words per minute on average. So you can see accuracy is in the independent level and his fluency looks pretty good. However, his performance on the comprehension questions was poor on 6th grade, which is his grade level, and also on 4th grade for both silent reading and for oral reading and for familiar text. So even topics that are familiar to him, he's doing really poorly on the comprehension questions. So obviously, comprehension is a need for Mark, but what exactly is the need within comprehension? Well, we can analyze comprehension miscues, so to speak, because within comprehension, there are different skills required of the student. One skill they need to be able to do is link ideas across a passage. That is called a relational inference. So, information given maybe in the beginning, toward the middle, being able to link these ideas to make an inference is a relational inference. There are also causal inferences, so cause and effect relationships. Failure to understand syntax is another issue. So that might be also things like word choice, excessive elaboration, or over-reliance on prior knowledge. And I see this a lot where kids are responding to questions because they do have topic familiarity using their background knowledge and not actually using the text. And I had no idea that, hey, there's actually a term in the reading world for that, and that is excessive elaboration. Failure to know a key vocabulary word. And I noticed that in the analysis of my students' comprehension, and I'll share that with you. And then just no response, having no idea where to go with that. So in looking at what Mark did, he only answered 6 out of the 25 inference questions correctly. He picks up information from one part of the text but can't integrate it with other parts. He had difficulty inferring the antecedent of the action or determining the consequences, so those causal inference skills. His most common response was just to insert or invent knowledge, not in the passage, so that excessive elaboration. And then there were a few cases where Mark didn't know the meaning of keywords in the passage or the question itself. And he had some difficulty with reasoning skills. So they give you this really nice chart for analyzing comprehension responses. And actually, what they used in this study was the QRI. So here you put the passage title, grade level, narrative, expository, prior knowledge, familiar, unfamiliar. But then you list the questions, the question type, whether or not they got it correct, and then what type of question this would be. What does the response require of a student? Is it a relational inference, a causal inference? Did they give a faulty elaboration? Do they have an issue with syntax, etc.? So just like you analyzed miscues for fluency and you categorize them as, they're having is it a visual cueing system issue or, semantic, syntactic? You can do the same thing with your comprehension questions. And this chart would just look lovely in your assessment chart or as a part of your initial assessment report. So wanted to share this tool with you, as well as some intervention ideas that came directly from this article. So they wanted to teach him question-answer relationships, QAR, which the authors on that are typically Taffy, Raphael, and Catherine Au are the ones associated with that great book. And actually, I just started using last year these books, which are great. I think they're $20 to $30 on Amazon, but they have them for each grade level band. So like 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 8. And they are QAR comprehension lessons geared toward that grade level. They include reading materials that are pretty interesting, actually. I think I've done 6 or 7 lessons with my student because this is a need of hers, and I've enjoyed using this. It's great resource. So with QAR, you label the question type and then teach the student how to identify the thinking required. And then even you can have them create their own questions using the different QAR labels. Direct explanation and modeling of the inference process, so using Think Aloud or Close to teach the basic idea. Teaching students how to code their text as they read, so MI is a main idea, connection, just things that get them more actively reading and processing the text, noting where they have an issue, where they don't understand something. And yeah, all right, so another thing mentioned in our course text is the importance of using a variety of higher level questions. On page 192, they give you, these higher level questions, very similar to Bloom's taxonomy, where it starts with just kind of the memory or knowledge level questions and moves up again to evaluation, similar to the hierarchy of comprehension. So making sure to have questions at different levels of higher level questioning will extend their thinking beyond literal comprehension. And then also in the chapter, they talk about retells. There are some advantages, like being able to figure out if the student can recall important information. Can they recall it in a coherent manner? Does their background knowledge impact their interpretation of the text? But there are also some disadvantages to keep in mind when you are looking at the retell. For instance, the student may understand the text but just be poor at retelling. Retelling is a skill in and of itself that may need to be taught to the student. They may have no idea how to approach the skill of the retell, especially if an English language learner. Just doing a recall and a retell in and of itself is not going to show you deeper comprehension, so you may need probes or you may need to develop additional questions to support the retell. And then a note, a student should always be told prior to reading that they will be asked to do a retell after. The next kind of area they talk about is metacognition, or thinking about thinking, and ideas for assessing that. They break it down into 3 areas. So metacognitive awareness, which is basically that the student is conscious about their thinking processes. And so ways to gauge that, you can give them a metacognitive awareness interview. There are sample questions on page 194, or you can do the Metacomprehension Strategy Index, which I've given before. I feel like the results are just kind of What I prefer to do is look at how the student is monitoring, and a way to do that is to use error detection tasks, where you give them a text that has some sort of error in it and see if they notice it or can comment on it. And then Manzo has the response self-appraisal method, where basically they kind of evaluate or appraise their responses to the comprehension questions based on how sure they think they are. But I really like the Think Aloud process, because that really sheds light on the thinking they're doing as they read and the thinking behind what they're reading, and that kind of makes it more apparent what's going on in their head. So another plug for the Think Aloud process. All right, so for chapter 6, they then wrap up on assessing attitudes and interests, which is kind of old news for us. They talk about performance assessment and portfolio assessment, which you can kind of skip over. And they do give you a really nice sample record form of assessment. So that might be a nice tool for you to look at. Moving over to the QRI 6, it again is all about analyzing and summarizing the information. They give you this chart, which I plugged in all the information for my student, and I think it's really helpful to have the, kind of side-by-side comparison. I wish the assessment chart was set up like this. I think this is definitely something you could integrate into that assignment or your initial assessment report. So here are the passages I gave. Immigration Part 1 was upper middle school. It was expository and it was unfamiliar. But my student, as you can see, had really high accuracy and acceptability. Did okay with the comprehension questions. It's interesting to see generally, 5 was the number of questions here, and 4 was the number of questions there. So she actually got 100% on the implicit questions correct, but then struggled with the explicit correction. So even with a look back, she still missed 1 explicit question here, and then she missed 2 explicit questions without look back. So that really put her at the instructional level. Words per minute, words correct per minute was okay, as I mentioned before in the assessment chart screencast, a little bit slower. For immigration part 2, what was interesting was this text was familiar, I think because she had just read immigration part 1. This one I did a silent reading of, so I didn't have information about accuracy, and I also didn't time it, so I don't have any information about words per minute there. But again, you'll see explicit questions is definitely the weakness. So now what I need to do is go in and look at those explicit questions and why is she missing them, and really do a deeper analysis there. As you know, I dropped down and gave her a level 6 to see how she did. And it's interesting because even though this was a lower level, it was narrative and it was familiar, so typically they perform better on this, right? Had the same accuracy and acceptability exactly. So she's pretty consistent with that. Words per minute, words correct per minute, as expected, was significantly higher because this is an easier text. And then, comprehension was solid. So she definitely is independent on the 6th grade level, but is instructional on this expository for the upper middle school level. And then, rate is really suffering there, as well as that explicit comprehension, which is kind of interesting because usually implicit comprehension is built on a solid understanding of explicit comprehension. So in QRI 6, they, ask the question of how do you make sense of all this information? So, you made this lovely data chart with side-by-side comparisons, and you kind of can now see what's going on. Well, how do you make sense of all this information? So they have these guiding questions for you to think about. What is the student's highest instructional level? Can a student have more than 1 instructional level? So in my case, her highest instructional level is that upper middle school. Can she have more than 1 instructional level? Probably. I'm wondering if I gave her a narrative at upper middle school, how she would do with that, a narrative on a familiar topic, if maybe she would get independent. And so then she'd have actually a higher level of instruction for the narrative genre. How accurate is the student in identifying words? For me, she's really accurate, above 98% for both 6th grade and upper middle school. How automatic is the student in identifying words? So that is an area of need for my student, as it is below that plus or minus 10 of the 50th percentile on Hasbrook and Tyndall. Is there a difference in the student's ability to identify words in context and words in isolation? She was really accurate on the word list and also really accurate for words in context. So I don't think there is a significant difference there. What types of text can the student handle most successfully? I kind of wish I would have given a upper middle school narrative, because it would be interesting to see how that compared to the expository text. What modes of reading represent strength for the student? She seemed to perform similarly on silent reading as she did with oral reading, slightly better on the silent reading, which was immigration part 2, but then that was also a familiar passage, so that could explain why she did better on that. How does the student perform on familiar versus unfamiliar text? It seems like unfamiliar text she's weaker on. How does the student perform with lookbacks and without lookbacks? Lookbacks definitely help her, but they don't fix that explicit comprehension need entirely. What comprehension strategies does the student employ while reading? And as you know, I did the Think Aloud process, and it was a lot of restating And gosh, I wouldn't even call it paraphrasing because it was a lot of verbatim restating. So not even, putting it in her own words. So really just restating what the text said. And I didn't do the inference passages, but I would recommend trying some of those out because it gives you a nice link as they're aligned to Common Core standards. So I did want to show you some of the kind of raw data from my assessment. So again, I can go over what to look at. So with the retell, we want to be seeing not just the number of ideas recalled, but really what they are recalling. And really easily you can see she is very focused on details, and all of the things she has recalled are detail statements. And this could explain why explicit comprehension is suffering, is because she's not seeing the bigger picture of the main ideas and what the specific main ideas are. So I know one of the things I wanted to work on with her are text structures, because I'm seeing an expository text. She's not really understanding how the text is structured or organized and only is recalling details. Then when I look at the questions she missed, one of the questions she missed was, why did farmers leave Europe and come to America? Well, the answer is land became scarce, and that is directly from the text. And so first of all, so when I asked her and she said America had better soil, and never do they talk about the soil, but they talk about land. And I'm wondering if she's thinking land at the literal level of like the actual soil, I'm also wondering if she knows the word scarce, if this is a vocabulary issue. When I gave her the look back, she found that it is harder to have land, so harder to support families, and farm workers were replaced with machines. And in America, there was more opportunity for work and land. So ultimately, she got the answer with the look back, but initially this whole big idea was missed on her. And that was not something that she had recalled in the retell. And then the second question she missed were give 2 examples of pull factors that affected immigration. And she had no idea what a pull factor is. And so in the article, they explain what a push factor is and what they were, and then what pull factors are and specific examples of those. So, that was the text structure essentially was the push and pull factors for immigration to America. So, these are kind of like big picture, explicit ideas that she just didn't get. So that would be what I need to focus my comprehension on with her, possibly text structure too, and how that plays into understanding the text better. So that's kind of my sample analysis for you there. Other places you can look for help or for more models. In Instructing Students, pages 205 to 209, they have that sample assessment report with a brief narrative description of what they found there with that student. QRI 6, pages 70 to 71, has another case study. Carlos, they give you his summary or student profile sheet. They're calling that kind of data summary the student profile sheet. And then they discuss what that means for him instructionally. I also love in QRI 6, pages 74 to 76, has 4 more student examples where they discuss the results and what that means for instruction. And then in the next step forward, each developmental level, so emergent, early, transitional, fluent, has a decide section. And in the decide section, they give you their own assessment summary tool with directions for how to complete that. Not important for us, but maybe important for you as a classroom teacher. They give you directions for how to form groups based on your assessment results. They talk about pinpointing a focus for intervention, how to select text for your developmental level that are going to match your instructional focus, and then also give you information about gathering your materials, what exactly you're going to need for instruction. So here are some other things to look at if you need help with better, understanding, analysis, that piece. Really, you're just thinking about, okay, what is the need? And then, what skill is really needed? Okay, they missed some explicit comprehension questions, but what is unique about those comprehension questions? So to leave you, I have a quote from Peter Afflerbach, and it is, "The questions that students encounter related to their reading can shape their stance toward reading and knowledge and their very beliefs about the authority of the text. Just as important, the questions we ask of students consistently communicate what we value." So another statement kind of supporting the idea that if you just ask low level, literal multiple choice kind of questions, then that's what they foresee being important in life and important to you as their teacher. We really want to broaden their horizon and ask them ranges of comprehension questions that employ all those different levels of comprehension and Bloom's taxonomy. So things to think about and to ponder as you wrap up your assessment and think more about your comprehension assessment results and do that analysis. So good luck to you. Let me know if you need anything and have a great week.